Despite how far we've come in pursuit of trans liberation, there is still an ongoing attack on trans rights. One of those battles is trans women in women's sports. Currently, in the US, as counted by the ACLU, there are 25 states in which there is a law considered barring or restricting trans women from sports. The narrative is that by virtue of having a Y chromosome, trans women have an absolute and irreversible advantage over cis women, and therefore, if we allow trans women to go into women's sports, that soon we wouldn't even have women's sports, as all the top prizes would be won by trans women because of their massive advantage. Part 1. The transphobic narrative. Of course, as with any conversation that we have about whether we afford trans people basic human rights, we first need to consider the transphobic narrative. Because although not every single person that talks about this issue is a transphobe, a lot of them most certainly are. Take this PragerU video, for example, in which a taller, mustached, short-haired person with leg hair beats a shorter, longer-haired person. The narrative is that women's sports is being invaded by men who are out to suppress real women so they can never win a prize again. Part of this narrative is that it erases women's achievements. Imagine, they say, you're a woman and you work your entire life and you work and you train so hard just so you can be the best in your class in sports, just for a biological man to come in and steal your spot on the leaderboard. This line of reasoning, of course, ignores the fact that trans women also train and don't just identify as women for an easy win. This is, of course, a lie. No one solely identifies as a woman to get an easy medal in sports. But it fits into the broader narrative painted by conservatives and TERFs, or trans-exclusionary radical feminists. This narrative is that trans women are really men invading women's spaces and making women unsafe. It's the same conversation, essentially, as what we're having when we're talking about which bathroom trans people should use, which prison they ought to go to. It's also important to note that most transphobes won't just come out and say that they don't like trans people because they're weird and don't want to be confronted by their existence. Transphobes typically adopt the language of protection. Protecting women, protecting children, protecting trans people from themselves, protecting lesbians, all of that. In reality, of course, it's not about protection. If anyone is in need of protection, it'd be trans people. But that's not part of the narrative. Even if transphobes take up a more nuanced position and say, well, it's because trans women have a significant advantage, you can notice that transphobes, by the language they use, they will refer to trans women as biological men and rarely refer to them as women at all. When arguing about the advantage that trans women would have, they also often ignore the variation in cis women. If it's unfair for a trans woman to compete in women's sports because trans women tend to be taller on average, then what does that mean when a cis woman is taller than an average cis woman? It's simply a reality that humans aren't perfectly equal, even amongst members of the same sex or gender. The idea that the inclusion of trans women in sports is the only thing making sports unfair is simply not true. Completely normal variations in body type, like Michael Phelps's long arms or Usain Bolt's large height, can give these athletes an advantage over other athletes. The question is, when does that advantage become unfair? The truth is that transphobes don't care about this question at all. For one, because most of them don't actually care about women's sports. And for two, because they don't care about whether other things can give you an unfair advantage. What if a cis woman has a higher percentage of testosterone circulating in their body because they suffer from hyperandrogenism? Does that make an unfair advantage? Well, does it give them an advantage? Part 2. The science. The core idea that men, women, and by extension trans women need to be separated in sport at all comes from the fact that we observe a difference in athletic ability between male and female athletes. This difference comes from the fact that male bodies are more androgenized, which means that they have more testosterone. It's this testosterone that causes all the changes during male puberty that lead to an athletic advantage in men. The things typically associated with giving an athletic advantage are more muscle mass, stronger bone density, more hemoglobin, a larger lungs, and larger heart. A key point, however, is that these differences aren't by virtue of having a Y chromosome, and instead are an effect of going through male puberty or having higher circulating testosterone. The difference in muscle mass and more hemoglobin, the things that carry the oxygen in your blood, are, for instance, directly related to how much testosterone you have circulating in your body at that point. Exactly the thing that hormone replacement theory seeks to change. The other things, larger lungs, stronger bones, are caused by going through male puberty. There's actually a lot of debate whether they cause an athletic advantage at all when not linked with higher rates of testosterone. There are, for instance, reasons to think that having stronger, denser bones, although can give you an advantage in relation to having more muscle mass, can also mean that you have more weight to carry around when you don't have that muscle mass. But even if these things did give trans women an advantage over cis women, they are all dependent on going through male puberty. Improving the use of puberty blockers and helping to identify gender dysphoria from a younger age can seek to significantly reduce the amount of trans women that have to go through male puberty in the first place, which isn't only a very good thing for the trans woman herself. In this case, it also means that trans women don't have any advantage over cis women any stage of their transition. Research shows that trans women who have undergone puberty blockers and HRT don't have an advantage over cis women. Research on this topic is scarce, however, and the research that I have read all mention that it is necessary to do more and longer term research to conclusively figure out when in a transition a trans woman who has gone through male puberty is on an equal level playing field with a cis woman. A research that does exist suggests that this is between 1 and 2 years of HRT, or a circulating testosterone level of less than 5 nanomoles per litre. But the research tells us more than this. In a systematic review of the literature relating to sport participation and competitive sport policies in 2017, it stated that, in relation to sport-related physical activity, this review found the lack of inclusive and comfortable environments to be the primary barrier to participation for trans people. This review also found transgender people had a mostly negative experience in competitive sports because of the restrictions the sports policy placed on them. The majority of transgender competitive sport policies that were reviewed were not evidence-based. And it concluded with saying, currently, there is no direct or consistent research suggesting transgender female individuals have an athletic advantage at any stage of their transition, and therefore, competitive sport policies that place restrictions on transgender people need to be considered and potentially revised. Part 3. Conclusion. The main takeaway from this video is that I'm not fully against any type of restriction or sport policy determining who can or can't participate in women's sports. The main point is that I want those policies to be based on evidence. And the fact is that right now, they're just not. Those laws aren't based on science because the science doesn't exist yet. I do, however, consider not allowing trans people to be in the league that they identify with to be a huge infringement on trans rights. And therefore, that decision shouldn't be taken lightly. As of this moment, I see two options. Either one, we force trans people to participate in the league that with the gender that they were assigned with as birth. Not only is this terribly invalidating, not that many transphobes would care, it's also a very bad thing for, well, everyone. You've probably seen this photo on the internet. It's one of the poster childs of trans women in sports. Because it looks bad. You see, the trans women will say, they're not even trying to transition anymore. That's clearly a man fighting a woman. And, well, that's true. That is a man fighting a woman. Because that is Mac Beggs, a transgender man. And he wants to participate in men's sports, but because of state law, he's not allowed to. You see, what many people fail to recognize is that if you force trans people to participate with the gender they were assigned at birth, that also means that trans men will have to participate with the women. And trans men take testosterone, which is the exact steroid that causes the athletic advantage in the first place. The second solution is to let trans people participate with the gender they identify as. And that we can leave some room for restrictions. But if those restrictions are enforced, they need to be based on evidence. Furthermore, I cannot emphasize enough how much the current push to bar or ban trans women from sports doesn't have anything to do with making women's sports more fair or anything like that. It's a deliberate attack on trans rights. It has nothing to do with making women's sports better, but everything to do with making trans women's lives worse. The fact of the matter is that these laws are not based on scientific evidence. Unfortunately, it continues to be very important that we fight for trans rights. And if you want to do something, I'll leave a link in the description where you can make a difference. As for me, well, there's a lot of topics that I couldn't get into in this video and that I want to get into at a different video. So if you're into this kind of content, consider subscribing. As for this video, well, thank you for watching, and I hope to see you next time.